Well, hey, good morning, everybody. So we pick up in John chapter 19 this morning, and what we're seeing is the way that we deal with death. So Jesus has just died, and now his closest friends, what they're doing is they're wrestling with the pain of death in their life. I spent some time this week just researching ways that people typically try to elongate their life. Because I think it's natural that all of us, we have a fear of death. We want to do whatever we can to actually avoid it. So I was looking at different ways, and it's like all the typical stuff that you would imagine. Eat healthy, get 8 hours of sleep, don't smoke, don't drink too much, that kind of thing. But what blew my mind this week when I was researching ways to elongate your life is that actually flossing your teeth every single day, actually, it's been proven scientifically to elongate your life, to make you live longer. It blew my mind that life is that fragile that even something as simple as just putting floss between your teeth every night, that can actually affect our lifespan. Life itself is so fragile, and dealing with death is so hard. I read this week a eulogy that Martin Luther King Jr. gave to the 16th Street Baptist Church after they were mourning bombing that they had experienced. And this is what he said. MLK said that death comes to every individual. There's an amazing democracy about death. It's not aristocracy for some people, but a democracy for all the people. Death is the irreducible common denominator of all men. Aren't you glad you came to church today? Death is a guaranteed reality. That if you're not facing it now, you will one day. It's one of the guarantees of life. And it's one of the most tragic, one of the most heartbreaking things that we can go through. And so how do we actually deal with it? When we face our own death or the death of a loved one, how do we address it? How do we mourn well? How is it that we can actually face this irreducible common denominator of all people? And that's what John wants to show us in this passage. Jesus has died, and now we're looking at the aftermath of his funeral and what happens after. And so what I want to talk about today is how do we address death? How do we grieve well? And how do we have hope when we're actually confronted by the end of life? So I want to show you first, when we pick up in John 19, we see responses to death. And so let's just look at three of them. We're going to see three common responses that we have when we face death in our life. The first response we see is fear. If you have a Bible with you, you can look with me at John chapter 19. We're going to pick up in verse 38. Verse 38 says this. It says, "After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, he asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him permission. So he came and he took away his body." So Joseph of Arimathea, he's incredibly rich. He was on Sanhedrin. He has a lot of influence. But even Joseph, he knew it was dangerous for him to be associated with Jesus. Jesus was brutally murdered by crucifixion. He'd been accused of sedition, of betraying his country. And so now Joseph knows it's an incredibly risky move to be associated with Jesus. And so this passage tells us, verse 38, that he has this fear in his heart. Joseph, he's been confronted by death, and his heart's afraid. He's afraid of the public consequences. He's afraid of what will happen if people actually find out that he's a disciple of Jesus. He's afraid what would happen to him in his own life. It's really interesting to me. Despite the fear that Joseph feels, he actually shows remarkable courage in this passage. He still goes to Pilate, the ruling leader, and he asks for the body of Jesus, and he begins the burial process, which, by the way, how crazy is that? Joseph knew he was about to be rejected and scorned by almost all of his peers for going to ask to bury Jesus. And he goes to do it anyways. He goes and asks Pilate, he says, "Can I have the body of Jesus to bury him?" Joseph, he knew the consequences, but he did it anyway. The rest of John 18, it shows us that Joseph, he's joined by Nicodemus to have a funeral for Jesus. So what Joseph and Nicodemus do together is they bring the spices and the linen cloths. They take the body of Jesus to a garden tomb, and they lay him down for burial. one of the things that Joseph shows us is that it's incredibly common to fear death. That is a natural human emotion for us to have. There's something about that that just, it strikes fear into our hearts. I think it's really interesting that Genesis 3, when sin and death first enter the world, the very first response that we see, one of the first emotions that we see from Adam and Eve, it's fear. They hide in the garden. They're afraid. They know that God's coming, so they hide themselves. We all fear death in one way or another. For me, I mean, my greatest nightmare in life is Alex dying. Like, I struggle to imagine my life without her. We fear death. Death is one of the most terrifying, one of the most tragic things that we can experience. There's a second response that we see to death in this passage. It's anxiety. Look with me at John chapter 20, verse 1. It says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark, and she saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, 'They've taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they've laid him.'" So Mary Magdalene, she loved Jesus. Just a little bit of context. She had been possessed by demons, and Jesus had rescued her out of that. And then she had devoted her life to following Jesus. I mean, Jesus was her rabbi, her teacher, the one that she had devoted her life to. And now he's dead. She goes to his tomb, and his body's gone. I mean, you can almost feel Mary's anxiety when she goes to Peter and John, and she says that, "I don't know where they've taken his body. It's gone." You can feel the worry in her heart. She's anxious. She doesn't know what they've done with Jesus. Anxiety is an incredibly common response to death. Feeling restless in your heart, consumed with worry, being so anxious that you can't sleep. That's the second response that we see in this passage. Let me show you one more. Mary shows us the third response to death. It's grief. Look with me at John chapter 20, verse 11. It says, "Mary stood weeping outside the tomb." Mary, she's overcome with grief. She sits outside the tomb and she weeps. The one that she loves most, he's gone. One of her closest friends, the person that she's devoted her life to, her Messiah, is dead. And so now she's overcome with grief. And so she breaks down and she just cries. There's three emotions here. We see fear, anxiety, and grief. All incredibly common human responses to death. I think one of the lessons that we can draw here is that it's good and right to mourn death. As Christians, there's nothing wrong for you to feel fear, for you to feel anxiety, for you to grieve the death of a loved one. Part of what John's showing us is that that's just a normal human emotion. As Christians, we're not called to just suppress our emotions, to just shove them down. I was learning more this week about Stoicism. One of the earliest alternatives to Christianity was Greek Stoic thought. It was all about suppressing your emotions. And one of the leading Stoic philosophers, Epictetus, he said this. He said, "If you kiss your child or your wife, say that you only kiss things which are human, and thus you will not be disturbed if either of them dies." I'm like, bro, that's so dark. Do you hear what he's saying? He's like, hey, when you kiss your loved ones, say they're only human. Say if they die, it doesn't bother you. That's not the Christian way to respond to death. As Christians, we mourn death. We're grieved by it. We break down. We cry. We feel afraid. We feel anxiety over death. Christianity is not Stoicism. We fear death, and rightly so. Listen, you know at the core of who you are that death is not the way this is meant to be. We are meant to live forever with the ones that we love. And when we're confronted with death, it's good and right to mourn. Every bone in our body cries out, this isn't how it should be. You know, as Christians, we shouldn't suppress our feelings about death. We should actually express them to God and to one another. Maybe you're facing death right now in your life. One of the things that grieves my heart the most is to watch in our congregation the amount of death that we're facing, either in our own personal health or with a loved one. And listen, if that's you, I want you to express your pain. Take it to God. Grieve, mourn, feel the hurt and the suffering. When you feel afraid, go to God with your fear. He wants to hear from you. When you feel angry, when you feel rage because of death, go talk to God. That's like so many of the Psalms, is just going to God in our pain, in our suffering, in our anger, and expressing it to Him. When you feel anxious because of death that you're facing in your life, God wants to hear that. He wants to hear that from you. He wants to talk with you about it. When you're grieving and you're mourning, God, He wants your pain and your tears. So bring it to Him. Talk with Him about it. And we should also take it to one another. We're supposed to carry these burdens with one another. Mary, she goes to Peter and John. Who's the Peter and the John in your life that you can go to, that you can talk about this with, that you can mourn? God, He wants our tears and our pain and our hurt. He wants to hear from you. Death is so tragic and it's heartbreaking. And so we should express our pain and our suffering, but we need more than that. You know that. We need a way to actually have hope in our grief and in our pain. And what John chapter 20 shows us is that there's a way for us to have hope. There's a way for you to have hope when you're confronted by death. There's a way to actually have life beyond death. There's a way to know that this life isn't the end. There's a way while we mourn and are afraid and feel grief and anxiety, there's a way to still be sustained through all of that. And John wants us to see it. He wants to show us it's the resurrection. That's where we can go when we're confronted by death. We see there's actually a way for us to have life beyond death. There's a way for us to know that, that there's eternal life for us and for the ones we love. Because Jesus rose from the dead, we can actually have eternal life, and death has actually lost its power over us. Before we talk about the personal benefits of the resurrection, I just want to talk for a moment here about, there's an immediate objection, I think, that comes up when we start talking about stuff like resurrection from the dead. I think it immediately, in 21st century modern Western minds, there's an immediate objection that says, hey, come on. Resurrection? Really? We've moved on past stuff like that. We don't believe in silly myths like people rising from the dead. I'm sure you've heard something like that at some point. I think we have to address, did Jesus actually rise from the dead? Did He actually come back to life? You know, is it possible for us as 21st century modern people living in Boston to actually believe in something miraculous as the resurrection? I mean, let me just ask you, like, if a skeptical friend comes to you and asks you, how do you even know that the resurrection is historically reliable? How would you answer that? How would you respond? I want to talk about that for a minute. I want to show you the historicity of the resurrection. It's historically reliable. Let me show this to you in John chapter 20, verse 3. It says, so Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Now, just to pause there for a moment. You know that John is such a bro because he put this verse in the Bible. John's like, hey guys, me and Peter, we were racing to the tomb, and guess what? I'm faster than him. Just so you know, I'm the one who actually outran him. I made it there first. John, he keeps going in verse 5. He describes what he actually sees when he gets to the tomb. He says, in stooping in, he saw the linen cloths lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came following him and went into the tomb. He saw the linen cloths lying there and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. And then the rest of John 20 and 21, it goes on to describe the interactions that the disciples have with the risen Jesus. I just want to point out, notice how much detail is in that passage. John, he's already, in a lot of detail described the burial process of Jesus, the spices and the linen cloths and the tomb that they put him in. And then notice in these verses, he's very meticulous in the details that he lays out. He's describing where the linen cloths that were on Jesus, how they were folded. He's describing the location that they went to. Just the simple observation that I want to point out is that what John's writing for us in John chapter 20, he's writing this as history. This is not myth. John did not intend to write this as just some make-believe fairy tale. He's recording history for us to hear about. Each of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's widely recognized by scholars today that all four of the Gospels, they weren't written as mythology. They were actually written as a Greco-Roman bios. That's roughly equivalent to what we today would call a biography. What I'm trying to say is that when John's writing this, what he's actually trying to do is to communicate historical fact. He's like, hey, let me show you historically the things that I saw so I can write them down so that you'll know them and pass them on. What John's saying is that he saw Jesus rise from the dead, and that now he wants to pass this on to other people. Now, I think it's still common. People would still object there and say, hey, I get maybe some dude 2,000 years ago could actually claim that he saw a resurrection, good for him and all. But we might say that as 21st century modern people, come on, we've moved past that. We're scientific now. We know that resurrections don't happen. That kind of thing isn't possible anymore. We think we're grown up, that we've moved past silly myths like people rising from the dead. N.T. Wright, he's a scholar at Oxford. He gives a brilliant response to this. He says, do you think it was only with Descartes or Locke and Berkeley and Hume or Kant that people suddenly realized that dead people don't come back? Early Christianity was born into a world where everyone knew that dead people didn't come back. This is not a new thing that modern science has suddenly discovered. What he's saying is these gospel writers, they're not these bumbling idiots who are just I guess a resurrection would be nice, so I'll just naively record this and pass along this misinformation to people. They were just as surprised at this resurrection as you and I would be. They knew that dead people didn't just suddenly pop out of the grave. And so what they did, they were shocked. And so what they wanted to do is write it down and pass it along to other people. What John's doing in John chapter 20 is he's recording historical fact as he perceived it to pass it along to other people. Let me just say one other thing while we're talking about this. I think if you just out of hand dismiss the possibility of a resurrection, I think that actually betrays an anti-supernatural Western bias. Let me describe a little bit of what I mean. We, as Western modern people, we assume, just kind of the air we breathe is philosophical naturalism. We assume that, just the things we can see with our eyes, just natural realities, that's all that exists. And that's not how, frankly, it's not how the rest of the world thinks. It's very common in other cultures and other worldviews to believe in miracles and to actually have witnessed miracles. I think it betrays a bias of just being a 21st century Western person if you just out of hand completely dismiss the possibility of miracles. Just one example, David Hume. He's a Scottish philosopher from the Enlightenment, 18th century, and he wrote one of the strongest critiques of the possibilities of miracles. And this is what he wrote in his Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. He wrote that miracles are observed chiefly to abound among ignorant and barbarous nations. Let's pause there, because did you hear that? What Hume is saying is it's just those ignorant, those barbarous people who actually believe in miracles. Do you hear how offensive that is? For David Hume, as a European, to look at other parts of the world and say, hey, they're just ignorant. They just believe in silly things like miracles. But us Westerners, we've moved on past that. We know stuff like that doesn't happen. Don't you see how narrow-minded that is? To really think that countries in the global south, that they're just ignorant and barbarous, just believing in silly myths like resurrections and miracles. It's very common in other parts of the world, both in the past and present, to experience miracles. Just one example, Pew Research. They report that today, 71% of Kenyans, 62% of Nigerians have today witnessed a divine healing. In other parts of the world, it's very common for people to witness miracles. So you can't just dismiss it out of hand. If the lived experience of people around the world is that miracles happen, won't you at least consider it? Won't you at least consider that resurrection and miracles are possible? I think if you start with an anti-supernatural bias, you'll always conclude that there's some other alternative explanation for the miracle of the resurrection. But I think if you're willing to actually look at the evidence, I think you'll see that it's historically credible. Let me show you just a little bit of the evidence, okay? Mark Strauss, he's a New Testament professor. He sums up facts. He gives us 5 facts that are widely accepted by scholars today across the spectrum, both Christian, non-Christian. And these are the 5 facts. He says, Jesus died by crucifixion in about AD 30. He was buried in a tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea. The tomb was discovered empty on the 3rd day after his death. Many witnesses then saw Jesus alive, and this event transformed the lives of his closest followers. I mean, what do you make of that? So we know Jesus, he died, he was buried, they found his tomb empty, and then hundreds of people said that they saw Jesus alive in the years following his death. And then this event, it completely transformed the lives of his followers, and it initiated a global movement that's transformed the world. I mean, what do you make of that? How do you explain these facts? One interesting thing, the disciples of Jesus, all of them were brutally murdered for their faith. All of them died in excruciating ways. Why would they continue, if they were just making up this idea of a resurrection, why would they continue to just lie about it? To just, even when it cost them their life, like they didn't get power, money, gratification, why would they just make up a myth about this? Like if your life is on the line, you're gonna tell the truth so that someone doesn't kill you. But they all went to the grave saying, no, we saw Jesus of Nazareth rise from the dead. I think it's because the most historically reliable explanation is that the resurrection, it really did happen. Jesus, he really did rise. He came back from the dead. One more story here. Molly Worthen, she's an accomplished historian at UNC Chapel Hill. Brilliant scholar. And she was incredibly skeptical, not a Christian. And she didn't believe in the resurrection. She didn't believe in miracles. And from her point of view, she's like, it's just not reliable. You can't believe in that kind of stuff. And also, I mean, other religions, they claim to have miracles. So how can, what makes Christianity unique? She's like, why should I believe that Jesus rose from the dead if there's all these things that make it implausible? But she started to actually look into the evidence. She took time to read a lot of the latest scholarship defending the historicity of the resurrection. She really looked into it, started to do her own research. And she said this was her conclusion. She said that the resurrection, it's the best explanation for the historical evidence we have. Do you hear that? Like, she's a historian at a reputable university, and she said the resurrection, it's the best explanation we have for the historical evidence. She took a close look at the evidence, and she said, it's true. The resurrection, it happened. Jesus, he really did rise from the dead. If I can just commend to you here, one of the books that really persuaded Molly Worthen, if you're curious, it's N.T. Wright's The Resurrection of the Son of God. I would encourage you, if you want a deep dive into the evidence, this is going to be the best resource out there. It's by N.T. Wright. He's a scholar at Oxford. If you really want to see is it historically reliable that Jesus rose from the dead, I'd encourage you to take a look. Look at the evidence for yourself and determine for yourself, do you think it's reliable? The resurrection, we believe it really did happen. Jesus, he rose bodily from the dead. But guys, I know a bunch of historical facts and logical proofs, that's not enough when we face death. When you're confronted by death and suffering in your life, you need more than just cold, hard facts. When you lose a loved one, when you're facing illness, you need more than that. And what John wants to show us is that we do have more than that. In the resurrection, we actually have hope. We have hope that we can actually face death, that we can actually make it through. Let me just show you the hope that we get from the resurrection. It's not only historically reliable, but I think it's the best foundation for you to have hope in your life. The resurrection, it's not only historically true, but I think it's the most livable explanation. It's the one that makes the most sense of our lives. Let me show this to you in John chapter 20. John, he shows us one final response to the resurrection in this passage. In verses 8 and 10, he shows us that when he sees the empty tomb, he responds with belief. Let me show it to you. John chapter 20, verses 8 and 10. He says, "Then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first, he also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes." So John, he enters the tomb, he sees it's empty, and then he tells us he believes. He sees it. There's no one there. The body's gone. And so for John, the unbelievable, it's now become undeniable. What this objective reality of seeing the resurrection, now it's actually become subjectively impactful. It's actually entered into his heart. He's believed. He's seen it. What John wants us to see is that from the resurrection, it's actually the thing that can hold our hearts when we're confronted by death and suffering. You know, all throughout John's gospel, Jesus, he's been saying over and over again that it's his signs, his works that he does, his miracles, that actually verify that he really is who he says he is. And what we get here in John chapter 20 is the ultimate sign. Like, this is the ultimate sign in John's gospel when Jesus actually rises from the dead. He comes back from the grave and lives again. And guys, listen, if someone dies and rises from the grave, like, that's the person I want to trust. Like, that's the one that I'm going to rely on. Like, the guy who's able to live again after death. Like, that's the best proof that we have that Jesus, he really is the Son of God. He really is the one who's come to save us from our sins. He really is the one that we can trust with our life. Just listen to these words from Jesus. This is John 11:25. Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live." Guys, that's the hope you have from the resurrection. Jesus is saying, I am the resurrection. I am the life. When you believe in me, though you die, yet you're going to live. What Jesus is saying is that, listen, death itself is not the end. By believing in me, you can have hope beyond death. You can trust that you will live forever because of me. Guys, what his resurrection does for you is he puts death in reverse. Death itself actually starts moving backwards now because Jesus has risen from the dead. Like, when Jesus came back to life, he's now promised that he gives life to everyone who believes in him. Like, the world itself is being made new because of the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. For Jesus, listen, death is nothing but a powerless opponent who is easily defeated and whose damage is being undone. That's what Jesus does through his resurrection. Tim Keller, he says it like this. He says, because of Jesus, everything sad is going to come untrue, and it will somehow be greater for having once been broken and lost. Guys, the resurrection, it really does change everything. Because Jesus rose from the dead, everything sad in your life, all the heartbreak, all the pain, all the suffering, it's going to come untrue. What Jesus does in his resurrection is he's moving death backwards. He's healing the pain and the brokenness and the suffering. The Apostle Paul, he says this so well in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, he describes the resurrection like this. He says, when the perishable puts on the imperishable, and the mortal puts on immortality, then shall come to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where's your victory? O death, where's your sting? Guys, the resurrection means that death's been defeated. Like, Jesus, he went and battled with death, and he won. Death is lost. It doesn't have victory over your life anymore. Like, death itself, it's a powerless opponent that Jesus has defeated at the cross. What Jesus promises is that because he rose from the dead, one day, the people that we love, they're able to rise too. Jesus is promising, he's saying, hey, I will give you a resurrection body. This body you have that's broken, that faces illness and pain and suffering. Jesus says, hey, one day I'm going to give you a new body. He says, I will give you a perfect resurrection body where there's no more suffering, no more pain, no more death. That's what Jesus gives you through the resurrection. Even your own death through Jesus can do nothing to you but make your life better. Guys, how powerful is Jesus? That now when we believe in him, when we die, we have an eternal life that's full of joy and peace and comfort. When we face death, all death can do to us is send us to heaven, where we can have joy and hope, where we can be in the very presence of God forever. Because of Jesus' death, it actually just becomes a door to a better world. That's how powerful he is. That's what the resurrection does in our lives. Because Jesus rose from the dead, you're able to get a new resurrection body. No more pain, no more illness, no more hurt. Joni Eareckson Tada, she tells her story about how the resurrection has given her hope. She had a diving accident when she was a teenager. She fell and she actually became paralyzed in all four of her limbs. She's a quadriplegic. She's been in a wheelchair for the vast majority of her life. And this is what she says about how the resurrection has actually given her hope. She says, if I were able, I would have my wheelchair up in heaven right next to me when God gives me my brand new glorified body. And I will then turn to Jesus and say, Lord, do you see that wheelchair right there? Well, you were right when you said that in this world we would have trouble, because that wheelchair was a lot of trouble. But Jesus, the weaker I was in that thing, the harder I leaned on you. And the harder I leaned on you, the stronger I discovered you to be. So thank you for what you did in my life through that wheelchair. And now you can send that wheelchair to hell if you want. Guys, that's the hope we have because of the resurrection. There's no suffering, there's no pain, there's no death that gets the final word. Jesus promises that even the worst hurt, the worst pain, the worst illness that we encounter in this life, he says, hey, I died for that. I died to put an end to that. Because of Jesus, you get a new body when you believe in him. You get the promise that one day in the resurrection, your body will be made new. Don't you see what Jesus has done for you? What he did on the cross is he went and battled with death. He took an excruciating death in your place. The death that we deserve because of our sin, because of our constant rebellion against God, our failures, all the ways that we've rejected God. Jesus, he died for that. He took the death that you deserve. He actually took it on the cross so that you could have life. Listen, when he took death on the cross, he died and went into the grave so that you could be forgiven and loved. And then he rose again to show that he conquered death. Like he went to war with death and he won and he put an end to it. And now he promises that there's a way for you to be forgiven and made new and have life forever through him. Guys, listen, if Jesus, if he overcame death for you on the cross, if he defeated death for you there, don't you think he'll stand with you now? When you face death and suffering in your life, why would he abandon you now? If he took the most excruciating death, the worst suffering in your place on the cross, don't you think that he'll be with you to give you life? What he promises is that he'll give you life. He'll sustain you through your suffering and your pain. He's promised that there's a resurrection one day. And there's no reason to think that that promise has an expiration date. Because Jesus rose, we will rise too, because we believe in him. Guys, when you face death in your life, it will be excruciating. I can't claim to have all the answers about how do we perfectly face death. Listen, guys, death, it's a horrible tragedy, and it is one of the most gut-wrenching things that we will ever face. But when we face death, we can have hope in Jesus. We can turn to him and actually be able to have hope to face death in our life. When you face death, when you're confronted by it, I want you to find hope in the resurrection. I want you to meditate on verses like 1 Thessalonians 4:14. It says this, "For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep." Guys, for Jesus, raising someone from the dead, it's just like waking up someone from a long nap. That's how powerful he is. He raises us from the dead. Won't you trust him? Won't you let your heart rest in him? Listen, when you feel afraid, and you should feel afraid when you face death, I want you to take your fear to Jesus. Talk with him about it. And then let your heart trust him. Trust him that he is good. He took death for you on the cross. He's promised he's going to sustain you now, and one day he's going to give you a resurrection body. When you feel anxious in the face of death, I want you to go to Jesus to find your peace. I want you to find peace knowing that he's with you, he's present, and he's actually promised that because of his resurrection, everything really will be all right. When you're mourning, and you should mourn when you face death, I want you to take your grief to God. And I want you to find hope in the resurrection, knowing that because he rose from the dead, you can have hope to face anything in life. In his speech to the 16th Street Baptist Church, MLK went on to say this. He said, "I hope you find some consolation from Christianity's affirmation that death is not the end. Death is not a period that ends the great sentence of life, but a comma that punctuates it to more lofty significance. Death is not a blind alley that leads the human race into a state of nothingness, but an open door which leads man into eternal life." Guys, that's what Jesus has done for you. He's taken death and he's turned it from a blind alley to now being an open door into eternal life forever. Listen, when you face death in your life, I want you to go express your pain to God and to one another. We should grieve. That's good and right. We need safe outlets that we can go to mourn when we face death. But I want you to believe in the resurrection, to know it's historically true, and I want you to find hope there. I want you to find consolation and hope for life, that because Jesus rose again, you will rise too, and so will everyone who believes in him. Because of the resurrection, we can have hope to face anything in life. Let's pray. God, I pray that you would help us. Lord, death is, God, it's such a terrible tragedy. And Lord, would you just help us, God? We desperately need your help. God, I pray that you would just take these few words that I've said this morning, and I pray that you would use them. I pray that you would take the word from Scripture that we've heard this morning, and I pray that you would use it to encourage our hearts. God, I pray that would you help us when we're grieving, when we're mourning, when we're hurting from the death that we face in our own life or the death of a loved one. God, would you help us to be able to face it with hope? God, I just want to pray right now for those in our congregation who are facing terminal illness or facing the loss of a loved one. Lord, would you help them to have hope because of the resurrection? Would you help them to know that because Jesus rose, we have resurrection life both now and forever. And God, I pray that as they grieve and as they hurt, I pray that they would be able to find hope in you. Lord, it's in your name I pray. Amen.